welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday. Today we're looking at Georgia O'Keeffe. She's our artist for the week, and we are going to be making some close-up flowers just like she made in many of her paintings. So I'm actually going to be doing some watercolor painting today, and I'm going to be using watercolor paints that I inherited from my mom. She gave them to me and she created this beautiful palette, and they came from tubes but have since dried on the outside, and then much of our colors that we're going to mix are going to mix right here in the middle. And I'm using watercolor paper. I will also be doing a tutorial with oil pastels for another way to look at how to create these close-up flowers. I am going to be providing in Google Classroom several pictures of flowers that I took from my personal garden, and that's exactly where I'm getting my inspiration photos from. So today in my watercolor painting, I'm actually going to be using a yellow flower. And the point of a close-up flower is to take a flower and what we would normally see as a flower and go really close up, and it abstracts it almost. So we're taking last week's learning of Kandinsky and the abstract work that he did and applying it to this week with Georgia O'Keeffe and really looking at the abstract and how to make something abstract. So I'm going to start by taking my piece of watercolor paper, and I'm going to cut it and make it smaller and create a painting that is a quarter of the size. So now I even have a piece of paper that I'm going to be using for my pastels. I am going to use the watercolor paper. I'm actually going to turn it landscape instead of portrait because the photo that I'm looking at I obscured and I wanted it to be more of a landscape photo. So like I said, it's going to be a yellow flower. And I'm actually going to be drawing, really lightly sketching out where my watercolors are going to go. And hopefully that's going to disappear once I start painting. So I'm using my computer as the image that I'm going to obscure. And it has some really intricate insides of the flower in here, so I'm just really carefully going to go in and, like I said, just very roughly sketch out what those look like so I can get those colors in there later. There's my lighter areas. Now, when I do look at my inspiration photograph, I do notice that there are several areas in the background where it gets darker along the edges. I am going to wait until my watercolor initial layers dry before I start getting in some of those darker layers in there. But I'm going to go in now and get some darker green or more greener areas with the yellow, kind of mix in some different colors to capture those different areas that I see, the different colors that are happening in the middle. And I'm going back into those areas where I wanted a little bit more yellow pigment, and I'm just kind of tapping in some color, which again with water and science of water and that surface tension is going to pull it outward, and you're not necessarily going to see the tapping of the brush at that point. You're just going to see more pigment in those areas. give a little bit of depth to that part of the flower. Another thing that you might want to have on hand while you're doing this is a hair dryer. Hair dryers are great to dry your watercolor pieces faster. Otherwise, it takes quite a long time for just the natural air dry process. So the outer edges have dried, except for up in this general area up in there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna look and see in my inspiration photo, and I'm gonna look in these outer areas where I can see that it's getting a lot darker, where there's some depth within those petals. So I'm gonna go ahead and mix up some colors. I do like this kind of darker orange here, and I'm gonna bring in some of those yellows that I've already mixed up. And I wanna be really careful that I don't get too much of those darker colors in there, because the subtlety is really going to show up. So I'm gonna go ahead and try to load up my brush. When you have, you have enough paint when your brush is nice and together like this. If you start running out of paint, then you start to see individual bristles, and that's your brush telling you that you need more paint. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come in here and right along the edge, get that dark paint in there, and you can see there's some wet area where I had just put that paint. And so it kind of bled into that area, which that's okay. Again, that's kind of the beauty of watercolor, is it's gonna happen, and you either have to roll with it or change your mind. Artists don't make mistakes, they just change their mind, or like Bob Ross said, they're just happy accidents. So I'm gonna come back in here and get some more. And I am being very conservative with my color right now. I might come back in later with some darker oranges and get some darker values in there, but for now I'm trying to just get some general areas of differences in those color values. This area was definitely my already really wet area, so find some drier areas. Make the paint behave a little differently. You can tell the difference when I've painted an area that was already wet with watercolor. That pigment spreads out immediately, whereas if I go into where the area was already dry, that pigment pretty much stays where my brush puts it. So that's a big difference in watercolor. You'll notice that you can see lines in my brush strokes. That is on purpose. With my petals that I'm abstracting, I can see lines in them, and so I really want that paintbrush to bring out those lines that the petals are showing me within the photo that I'm seeing. So I'm gonna go in and really try to get those lines in there, but also getting the differentiation of the lights and the darks. And I'm just going to continue this all the way around, trying to work that outside and work outside in. Those darker colors are showing me are shadows within that flower, and those shadows are going to add that depth in there as well. So it's really important to be thinking of shadows again as color. We talked about that a little bit on our painting with the Van Gogh painting, to creating shadows using color instead of shadows using black. You'll notice that I won't use black in any of these because black really muddies up watercolor paintings, and so I'm going to use browns and oranges to create those shadows, because when you look at that photo, that is what creates those shadows in there, is those browns and those oranges It's just a variation in the color of the sunlight that's coming in. So it's really important that as artists, when we think about shadows, that we're looking at the colors that are showing up and that we're looking at. And it will make you look at the world differently. I know after I took my painting class at college from Professor Larry Gold, he taught me that. He taught me how to look at colors and how to change the way that I view the colors in the world around me. And I did start seeing shadows differently, and I do still look at the world differently as far as color goes. And it has helped to shape what my art looks like. So you can start to see when it's drying, you're seeing those lines in there. And the more that I use that dry, wet on dry technique, you can see the brush strokes of the paintbrush. And where it's wet on wet, you're gonna see that water balloon out. And so I really need to wait for this area to dry before I can add more to it, although I can get into this darker area back in here that is dry. So really let the canvas, your watercolor paper, guide you as you go and move on. So my middle is dry. Like I said, that is the darkest part. So I have some tips of brown on the edges of these, but there's a lot of green that's happening in the center there. So in an effort to really not muddy up my piece, I'm going to be very careful with how I use my colors and where I place them into my painting so that I can still get the idea of a flower, but I'm not going to change the fact that it's abstracted. If that's a word, I'm not sure that's a word, but I just made it once, so you're welcome. New words. I'm mixing up a green mixture. It's more of a yellow green mixture because that is pretty much how this is. These petals are, is it's a yellow green almost that's coming from them. And the brush stroke is trying to create the shape of the petals. So I'm using my brush stroke to create that. So to create my shadows, I am just going to use kind of that green and that brown mixed together. That's going to make a much darker color, and I want to create the colors that I see. I try to paint what I see. So creating that green and brown mixed together is going to give me that middle kind of a shadow that comes from the depths of that. You want to be really careful where you're putting those shadows, because if you get too much in there and then you try to paint some light colors over it, it's definitely going to make it feel muddy and really worked. And that is not the goal of this. Just because that yellow in there is definitely very wet. I want to make sure that I have a dry paper to put my next colors on. Now's a good time to go back into the areas on the outside. Now that they've dried, I might go in and add some browns in those shadows out in the outskirts to kind of give it a little bit more depth and dimension. Hopefully somehow erase those pencil lines. You could honestly just go in and just start painting without pencil lines, and that's a great way to get rid of that problem of having pencil lines if you wanted to. I don't mind, I don't hate it that it has pencil lines. Okay with that. I'm using this negative space of the outside to create the positive space on the inside. So using those dark colors to create the light colors in the center to really make it come to life. That's one of the ways that you can think about watercolor painting, is using that positive and negative space to really create those shapes of your watercolor and make it come to life on your paper. Do the same thing on the outskirts. What I'm noticing and why I'm adding some yellows to this is that the intensity of the colors in my photo that I'm using is pretty bright, and so I want to capture and get those colors into my painting, and so I'm coming in just with some brighter yellows over the tops of these to see if I can't capture the intensity of those colors that this flower has. So I need to let this dry for a little bit before I can really get those fine details in the last parts of this, but so far so good. It's definitely taking shape and it's giving me that really close-up center of a flower using watercolors and using those oranges and greens and brown. And I'm gonna let it dry and come back and add in those little brown details that are going to bring it to life and make it come together for me. Alright, so now I'm going to go back in and get some fine details. I do want to get a pretty intense green happening with the center area. So I have not very much water and a lot of green to give me this starburst effect in the center here. And I'm going to go back in and add in some intense browns and yellows and oranges as well on top of these greens. I'm just going in and softening up those edges for brown tips that I just added. Letting the water work its magic and kind of bring it a little bit softer areas in there. Do the same in the middle here. That was too much water. Probably like having those brown and greens in there. And then make it just a little softer. Just a little bit more on the abstract side. And then I can see that I want to get a little bit darker shadows right in the base of the flower in here. So just make that center area a little bit more defined, and how you define it is by bringing in some darker shadowing. So there you have it. There is my Georgia O'Keeffe inspired close-up flower from my garden. I really look forward to seeing your close-up flowers and what they turned out to look like, because I have a feeling they're going to be amazing. And I do love seeing your work. Don't be shy. I want to know that you're creating. I want to see what you're creating. I want to see the work that's happening in our community. I know that if you even just post it in your windows, maybe if I'm walking by, I'll get a chance to see your work as I go by on my bike with my family or on a walk by myself. But I do love seeing the artwork that's out there. So if you're not sharing it with me by emailing it to me or through Instagram or Google Classroom, try sharing it in other places that might bring other people joy as well. Okay, so now I am going to be creating the oil pastel and watercolor one. I actually decided to mix the two mediums of pastels and watercolors just so that we could get kind of a different effect with them. I really like the use of both of them, and the pastels create a really nice resist for the watercolor. So I'm choosing a different flower, and I'm actually choosing a different composition for that flower. So again, I'm going to start off with my pencil and do just a really rough sketch. This flower is going to be my absolute favorite color, which is that almost a neon purple, which I love. Purple, anything purple is phenomenal for me. I am going to start with my pastels. Now this was a set that I got for signing up for an art conference, an online art conference. These are neon pastels, which are a little bit different from regular pastels, but they do have these kind of neon purples that I'm looking for, which is why I'm choosing them. And then I am gonna go with this little neon orange. There's some orange specks in the middle that I want to showcase with the orange. They're almost a little flower within the middle of the flower. So I'm gonna showcase that with our neon orange pastel. It's almost an orange yellow. Okay, so I'm gonna start actually with that part because we always start with the lightest colors. And these are almost star shapes, which is really hard to do, tiny little star shapes with such a fine point. So do the best that you can if you are dealing with the same thing. This is supposed to be really almost abstract, so that's quite all right. And there were really only 4 that I could see in the middle. The rest are going to be tiny little dots that we're gonna create with our watercolors once we get there. Now the other part that I'm going to be using my pastels for is the outline and the tips along the edge here. And I'm going to not just outline, I'm going to create those lines that I created like I did in my watercolor piece, only this time those pastels are creating those lines of the petals. And again, you can see the watercolor paper that I'm using creates a really nice texture in there. Put that away for the next time. And then I really am I have some purples that are gonna come in here to get those dark. It's always dark right by the center of those flowers. It's gonna make this really pop. The other thing that's gonna make it pop is the fact that the middle of this flower is a really, really, really dark purple. So I'm gonna just go in and create that dark purple, only to come over it with some watercolor that's really going to make it even darker, get that depth involved with it. Okay, that's a really good foundation with those pastels. So now I'm going to go into my mixing set for my watercolors. And again, you start with the lighter colors. So this is just a basic Crayola mixing set. And what this is it has 2 of the reds, 2 yellows, 2 blues, and when you mix them together, it really gives some nice colors and a really broad spectrum of colors. So I'm starting with this magenta color, which is very similar to that purple that I'm looking for. It's a beautiful color. I am gonna go in and add in some of this ultramarine blue, not the cyan blue, but the ultramarine blue. And the reason for that is I want it just a little bit, oops, that was black. I want the blue. Just a little bit more purple. So by adding just a touch of that ultramarine, it's just gonna make it just that much darker. I almost think I got too much. There. Just to get a little bit of more of a purple rather than a pink, so that I can come into my painting here and really bring out those purples and make those highlights show up with the pink oil pastel that I used. Is you want to go edge to edge. Even with your watercolor painting, you want to go edge to edge. I don't want to see any part of your painting or artwork that has a white edge to it, because that means that we're not necessarily going as close up as we could. So now when I get into this center part, it was really dark. So I'm going to use a lot of my blue here. And since it's going to be very difficult to get that super dark blue, or even that super dark purple that I'm looking for, I might go in and add in, and I know I say don't do this, but I am going to add in a little bit of black. Not a ton, but just a little bit, because I do want it to get really dark. So watch, I'm just gonna barely touch in. It just adds a little bit of a darker value to it. So when I go into the center here, I'm getting that dark value. And there was almost like teeny tiny pinpoint drops in the center here. So that is why I'm using the tip of my brush to create little dots as I paint this in. Bit in the edge, that's okay, because again, we already went into that area with the oil pastel, because those areas are definitely darker areas. So this is just a really natural way to get those dark areas as well. We're getting really close. I really like how orange is popping in the center there, that the pink of the oil pastel is popping out as well. I might go in even with some more black and some more dark blue. Get it into that purple area in there with some water. And see if I can't just get it a little bit darker. Artists just always keep going into their work and looking at it, refining it, looking at it, refining it. Making sure there isn't any more that we could add or take away, make it better. That one got a little dark for me, so no worries. I can just go in and take it out a little bit. Watercolors did intimidate me at first because I thought, oh man, there's no mistakes that can happen in art. But really the reality is there are no mistakes. Again, happy accidents. Change your mind, go in, try to fix it. If it doesn't fix, you just go a different route. Artists are problem solvers, so just keep solving problems as you create your art. And there you go. That is the watercolor oil pastel resist for today's close-up flower tutorial. Remember, check Google Classroom. I was out there yesterday, Monday, handing out sketchbooks. I'll be out there today handing out sketchbooks and art supplies, and I'll be out there tomorrow, Wednesday.